Today's book is called The Language Myth, Why Language is Not an Instinct by Vyvan Evans. I think that's pronounced Vivian? Vyvan Evans. Right. So, why language is not an instinct. So there's a contradiction there that seems to be creating a question, right? Maybe you're thinking to yourself, wait a minute, why language is not an instinct? Who said it was an instinct? What are you talking about? So, if you're not familiar with this book or with these books, this book is actually written in response to another book. And that other book is The Language Instinct by Steven Pinker. So this book is called Why Language is Not an Instinct. And pretty much the whole of this book is just a rebuttal to Steven Pinker's book. I mean, I think there's one or two maybe tangents he goes on, but other than that, this whole thing is just purely written to rebut Steven Pinker. So, can you read it on your own? Like if you just saw this in the bookshelves and you wanted to pick it up without reading Steven Pinker's book? Yeah, I think you could. I mean, I don't know because I read Steven Pinker's book first, so I'm kind of having to imagine myself in the place of a new reader. But yeah, I think he gives enough context to what he's responding to that you could kind of pick this up and read it on your own if you wanted to. But really, I think to get the both sides of the argument, like the back and the forth, you'd want to kind of read them both. You'd want to start off with Steven Pinker's The Language Instinct, and then once you finish that and you've absorbed all of Steven Pinker's ideas, then you can go on to Why Language is Not an Instinct, and you get a nice back and forth there, and you can pour yourself a nice cup of coffee and just kind of contemplate who made the better arguments. It's it's good fuel for thought. So this video review is probably going to be a mess because I'm going to have to talk about two books at once. Both books are kind of talking about some kind of in-depth stuff, which is going to be difficult to summarize and still kind of make sense of. I'm going to have to kind of summarize Steven Pinker's book first before I even get around to what Vyvan Evans is talking about. But I don't know. I'm going to do the best I can, and if this video ends up being long and rambling and a mess, it won't be the first time. I've done lots of videos that are long and rambling and a mess. So let's just plunge into it. We'll see how far we get, how much we get through, what we can make sense of and what we can't make sense of. So, The Language Instinct by Steven Pinker was written in 1994. I think it's been updated a few times, but that was the original printing. I read the book 8 years ago in 2010. Now, I do not have a video review of it because I wasn't doing video reviews in 2010, although I did write a review on my blog at the time. What is The Language Instinct? So, Steven Pinker is essentially, he goes off on a lot of things, but I guess maybe the main part of the book, he is translating the ideas of linguist Noam Chomsky. So Noam Chomsky is a famous linguist. He's rather infamous because he leads two lives, one as a linguist and one as an anarchist. And kind of political commentator. But we'll leave the anarchist Chomsky aside for today and just kind of focus on the linguist Chomsky because, you know, we've got a lot of stuff to get through. So the linguist Chomsky came up with these ideas in the 50s and 60s of universal grammar. But Chomsky and his colleagues were writing kind of way at the top of academia. They were writing kind of really technical articles filled with all sorts of academic jargon, and it's impossible to read. I've tried to read it at various points, kind of getting Chomsky's kind of original linguistic articles. I can't make heads or sense of them. Chomsky's political writings are quite accessible, but his technical linguistic writings, very difficult for somebody who's not an academic to make heads or tails of. So, Steven Pinker's book translates Chomsky's articles into kind of common English that's accessible to everyone. And he also adds kind of some of his own other observations and kind of ideas on it and stuff like that. So what are Chomsky's ideas? Okay, so Chomsky believed in a thing called universal grammar. And universal grammar the idea is, let me back up. Universal grammar kind of starts from a problem. So all children learn their first languages remarkably well. Or, they learn it completely. And the mystery is they learn it without really appearing to learn. Like they don't kind of sit down and study the grammar of their native language. They just kind of absorb it. And what Chomsky observed is they seem to pick up on a number of grammatical concepts that they never get exposed to in the input. So they intuitively understand grammar that they never hear in the real world. If you analyze what adults say to children, children get very kind of impoverished input. The adults kind of speak very simply to children, like in baby talk. But then after about 4 years, children come up with this remarkably complex grammar. And they appear to just absorb it without really learning it. They don't kind of hear a lot of these grammatical structures in the input, but they understand them anyways. And all children in every language do this. So Chomsky theorized that we don't actually learn grammar at all. We are born with grammar as some sort of biological predisposition, kind of from evolution or, I don't know, God or whatever. We are born with the grammar already programmed into our brain. Now, the obvious question is, well, how can that be? Because the grammar of every language is different. Well, Chomsky's view is that actually the grammar of every language isn't so different. Now, this is controversial, so we'll come back to it later. But Chomsky thought that actually if you took like a cosmic view of it, I think Chomsky's favorite example is like an alien coming from outer space and visiting Earth. The alien would not see a whole bunch of different languages. The alien would see kind of one basic language with a lot of different variations on it. So the alien would notice that all languages use nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, that all languages have phrases and sentences and clauses, that all languages kind of group the words describing the noun in the noun phrase, and the verbs, the words describing the verbs in the verb phrase. I'm going to get through this. And so that these kind of commonalities that all languages have is called universal grammar. And children are born with this pre-programmed in. Now, is that making sense? Probably if you clicked on this video, actually, you probably have some background knowledge on this. So maybe I don't even need to explain it. But if it's not making sense, that's because I am trying to summarize in a few sentences what Steven Pinker did in his book, which was 430 pages. So it makes sense when Steven Pinker describes it. Steven Pinker makes a very compelling argument that children have innate grammar, that they do not pick up grammar from the language, that once they are exposed to a certain amount of language, their kind of universal grammar just kind of kicks in, and they kind of take the language and they map it onto the grammar structures which are already pre-programmed into their brain. Again, if this is not making sense when I describe it, it makes sense when Steven Pinker describes it. He spends 430 pages on this. He does a very good job of describing it. And this even though this sounds like a bit outlandish, this has been kind of one of the dominant theories in the field of linguistics for the past 50 years. Noam Chomsky completely took the field of linguistics by storm, and this has kind of been the model that everybody has either been working from or kind of working against, but either way, this is kind of the big elephant in the room, like this is a big thing everyone responds to. As crazy as it sounds, it makes sense on a number of levels, because when you think about it, when you think about language, for example, the words that are coming out of my mouth right now, I am, when I create a sentence, doing a number of very complex grammatical transformations, and I am not expending any conscious energy on the grammar at all. I am completely focused on the message of what I'm trying to say, and the grammar is just kind of automatic, subconscious. Now, I realize this kind of in my field as an ESL teacher, because I teach English as a second language here in Vietnam. And as a native speaker, you completely take for granted the grammar of your native language. But when you're teaching it to somebody, you've got to teach them kind of, all right, you know, this is a noun and this is a verb, and they've got to agree. And if you have a relative clause, like this is the house that Jack built, then you need to take two different clauses. This is the house, Jack built the house, put them together, replace a house with that, move that to the front because it's the object, delete the house, so then you come up with this is the house that Jack built, not this is the house that Jack built the house, because the house moves to the front of the clause. It's incredibly complex. It drives my students nuts. And I do it all subconsciously without even having to think about it. And in fact, native speakers are at a disadvantage when we have to teach our language because we don't even know the rules consciously. It's all subconsciously. We can't even, unless we study the grammar of our native language, we can't even begin to kind of describe to the students what we're doing subconsciously. So it does appear that language is kind of operating on this plane, which is completely separate from normal cognitive processes. It makes a lot of sense to me on some levels. Okay, so that's the language instinct. Now, the language myth, why language is not an instinct. Vivian Evans is saying, no, Chomsky and Steven Pinker are all wrong. And he says kind of the field is moving away from that now. He says Chomsky's theories were dominant at one time, but he's saying more and more linguists are now saying, no, this doesn't make sense at all. So the book is divided into kind of a number of chapters where he takes on kind of a number of things that Steven Pinker asserted. Pretty much every chapter in here is a response to something Steven Pinker said. So I'll go through an overview first. Let me take a step back and describe why this book came into my hands in the first place. Why did I bother reading this? So I was at work and teaching English in Vietnam. And a new coworker came in, somebody who just started the job, and he had been studying cognitive linguistics as an undergraduate, and he is going to be studying cognitive linguistics as a doctorate student in the future, and he was just taking kind of 1 year off to teach English in Vietnam in the meantime. Now, believe it or not, in the field of language teaching, at least in the field of English as a second language teaching, people who have actually studied linguistics are very rare. You think it would kind of go hand in hand, right? Language teaching, linguistics. But most people kind of out here in Asia teaching English have not studied linguistics. They are like me. They're kind of history majors or literature majors who kind of graduated with these general humanities degrees and then couldn't figure out what to do with their degree, and so kind of ended up teaching English out here in Asia. People who actually know what they're talking about are very rare. So, I was quite interested in this and struck up a conversation with him. And I said, you know, I don't really know anything about it. I was a history major, but I did read The Language Instinct by Steven Pinker, so I know at least about the idea of universal grammar and Chomsky. And he said, oh, no. That's wrong. It's all wrong. The field is moving completely away from that now. None of my professors believe that anymore. And I said, what? I thought that's what everyone believed. I thought that was a dominant theory in the field. And he's like, no, I'll bring you the book tomorrow. So he brought me the book. Now, my reading list is terribly disorganized. I'm reading like 10 different books right now, not making progress in any of them. So I said, I appreciate it, but I don't really have space in my reading list for another book. I'll look at it, but I can't read it. But then I flipped through it, and it's actually very readable. Like Vyvan Evans, like Steven Pinker, both of them are writing for a general audience. They're not writing for a technical linguistic audience. Both of them are good writers who are kind of writing with a general readership in mind and are engaging. So having flipped through this, and you can often tell at a glance whether a book is going to be readable or not. Having flipped through this, I said, okay, actually, yeah, what the hell. Maybe I do have time for it. Throw it on the reading list. And so I decided I was going to read this anyways. Having read through the whole thing, I'm happy to report it's perfectly readable. Although if I had to choose, Steven Pinker's the better writer. Vyvan Evans is not quite in that class. Steven Pinker is just a really engaging writer who just brings in all sorts of interesting examples to illustrate his point. Vyvan Evans is certainly readable enough. That being said, I do have to confess that I took about kind of 4 months to read this thing, which isn't a big book. Some of this is because I got distracted. Again, I'm reading 10 other books at once. But he does, some of these chapters are a little bit slow going because he's just kind of making the same point repeatedly again and again and again with more and more examples. I think his chapter on animal communication is a prime example of it, where it just goes on and on and on with more examples. At the prose level, his ability to write sentences is not bad, so no problem there. But I think just kind of on the organizational level, some of it can be a bit repetitive. Now, of course, that's me complaining from a reading enjoyment standpoint. In terms of him kind of arguing his point, I don't know, maybe he needs all those examples to make his point as clear as he wants to make it. But just kind of as a reading enjoyment point, sometimes I got a little bit bogged down. Okay, anyways, that background aside, he goes through these chapters which all kind of reflect something in Steven Pinker's book. So, Steven Pinker says that human grammar is just leaps and bounds different from anything in the animal kingdom. Dogs bark and cats meow, but there's nothing like grammar anywhere in the animal kingdom. Vyvan Evans disagrees. So he has a whole chapter 2 here, talking about how some of animal communication is actually not that different from human grammar. You can read them both and decide who you agree with more. Then language universals. So Chomsky and Pinker believe that even though the grammar of languages appears different, at its most basic level, there are universals. Vyvan Evans disagrees. He says if you actually analyze the grammar of language, of all the languages, so not only English, but you do a cross-linguistic study of kind of all the languages, he says there are no universals. There's not a single case where you can't find some language that doesn't kind of match the universal. Even something as simple as kind of noun phrases and verb phrases. Noun phrases and verb phrases, Vyvan Evans kind of gives an example from Latin. He says, you know, in Latin the words are just kind of grouped all over the place. I mean, you know which words go with which because of the endings of the words, but they do not group them in noun phrases and verb phrases. Something as simple as every language has nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs. Vyvan Evans says, no, all languages don't have this. Some languages just have words, and then you kind of figure out kind of whether they're meant as a verb or a noun, just kind of based on how they're used in the sentence. Basically, there are no language universals at all, says Vyvan Evans. Then, is language innate? Like, do we have grammar pre-programmed into our brain? No, says Vyvan Evans. We do not. If you look at how children learn language, they do not appear to have this switch that lights up when they kind of are exposed to grammar. They just kind of very painstakingly kind of learn how to use words from examples in the sentence. Is there a language module in the mind? So, Steven Pinker, as part of his argument that grammar is pre-programmed into the brain, argues that there's a specific module of the brain that's just dedicated to grammar. And it's just kind of already pre-programmed in. Vyvan Evans says no. The neuroscience tests show that there's no section of the brain that's kind of dedicated to grammar. That's not how neuroscience understands that the brain works nowadays. There's no language module in the brain. Next, mentalese. So I didn't talk about this before, but Steven Pinker believes that thought is independent of language. So you don't actually think, your thoughts are not actually constrained by your native language. You think how you think, and then you kind of translate your thoughts into language, but your thoughts are not controlled by your language. Vyvan Evans says, no, there is good evidence that how we think is influenced by our native language. So kind of the way your native language will kind of frame concepts or ideas affects how you think about them. And related to that is the idea of linguistic relativism. So there's a Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is that your language, the language you use, affects the way you view the world or how you think about the world. Steven Pinker completely rejects this hypothesis. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis was apparently popular in the 1930s and then fell out of fashion. Steven Pinker says, okay, you know, people believed this at one time, but nobody believes this anymore. You know, this has completely fallen out of fashion. Vyvan Evans says, actually, no. There's still good evidence for the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Although Vyvan Evans also says that Steven Pinker creates a straw man. So Steven Pinker's version of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is actually not what it really is. So Vyvan Evans says, first of all, Steven Pinker got it all wrong. Second of all, people actually still do believe this. So that's the book. For the details, the nitty-gritty details, you're going to have to kind of dive in there and kind of read it for yourself to see all the points and counterpoints in details. Is this book worth reading? Well, yeah, probably. So The Language Instinct, if you haven't read it already, the original 1994 Steven Pinker book, is definitely worth reading. Agree or disagree. Now, this isn't just my opinion. I've seen a number of people kind of recommend The Language Instinct as one of those kind of books that everyone educated should read, whether you're into linguistics or not, because, you know, everyone should be kind of educated about all the major fields to some degree, ideally. And people say, you know, if you want to get kind of a good overview of some of the controversies and issues in linguistics, you should read The Language Instinct. And I kind of go along with that, this kind of consensus that I've seen. It is a book that every educated person should read, ideally. I mean, I know nobody has time to read all the books that every educated person should read, but ideally. And then, once you've read The Language Instinct, then pick up The Language Myth, because once you've given yourself one side of the controversy, it's only fair that you go back and you read the other side of the controversy. And both books are readable enough. Okay, now, who did I find more convincing? It's difficult to say. I think Vyvan Evans makes a lot of points which are really quite devastating against Steven Pinker and The Language Instinct. I think Vyvan Evans, he does appear to show that these language universals do not exist. So how can there be language universal grammar? He does show that kind of the modern neuroscience does appear to show that there's no kind of grammar module in the brain. And he spends a lot of time talking about how this idea of universal grammar as something we're kind of biologically pre-born with does not seem to fit into any kind of realistic evolutionary model. I mean, how could this have evolved? Something as complex as grammar kind of evolving and kind of, you know, the whole kind of mutation and adaptation and kind of the small changes that take place over millions of years. How could grammar possibly have evolved to that, especially since, he makes a point in the book, language is about communication. So in order for this to make sense in any evolutionary model, you need two people to make the adaptation at once for it to be beneficial, right? Because if just one person has it, then there's nobody for that one person to talk to. So you'd have to have the mutation occur simultaneously in two people. He really makes this point quite well in the book. He talks about how our articulatory apparatuses, like the, you know, how we make sounds with our mouth and throat, appears to have kind of co-evolved with speech. So the reason kind of our larynx is lower, our voice box is lower in our throat, kind of co-evolved with our ability to kind of speak. And these kind of things have to, these kind of gradual co-adaptations kind of have to happen together. If I'm making a mess of that, he argues it much better in the book. So I thought all of that was quite devastating against the theory of universal grammar. That being said, I do have a small nitpick to make. Chomsky's view of universal grammar and evolution is a bit unsophisticated, or at least so I'm led to believe by the articles I've read. Steven Pinker, in his book The Language Instinct, actually differentiates himself from Noam Chomsky. He says, okay, Chomsky doesn't really believe in an evolutionary model, but I do. And here's my model. And Steven Pinker spends like a whole chapter describing how universal grammar could arise in evolution. Evans goes after the softer target. So he completely ignores Pinker's model and just goes after Chomsky's kind of unsophisticated model. I still think he makes a very good case that universal grammar could not have evolved, but he does kind of ignore kind of Steven Pinker's more sophisticated argument, which is, it's a bit of a sleight of hand, especially because we know Evans read the book, because the whole thing is a response to Steven Pinker's book. I still think he makes a good case against evolution. He just, you know, he could have made a more balanced argument if he had gone after Pinker instead of Chomsky on that. Now, here's where I don't quite think Evans, oh no, I don't have time to talk about where I don't think Evans responded to Pinker. Okay, there are a number of things about language, critical period, the way we use language unconsciously, the way kind of children create grammar, which Pinker argues and Evans doesn't respond to at all, and I don't have time to get into it because the video review is over. I've got a 30-minute time limit. So I'm just going to end it here. You're going to have to read both books for yourself.